Hey guys, today we're actually going to get to start talking a little bit about astronomy. I know last week we started talking about astrology. We spent 2 days talking about astrology, and a lot of you were wondering why we're actually studying astrology in this class. And the reason that is because astronomy actually started from astrology. When this was first started, when astronomy was first started, astrology and astronomy were the same thing, and eventually they started branching off. But this week we're going to actually start about learning about the history of astronomy and how why actually these ancient cultures that we're going to learn about, why do they actually study astronomy? So were they studying it because they were curious, or was there a reason they had to actually study this stuff? That's what we're going to be talking about today and through the rest of the week. I'll go ahead and tell you about my beliefs about astrology. Personally, I can't stand astrology. I hate it with a passion. I don't believe in it. That's why I'm an astronomy teacher. I think there should be a set of facts to go with it. So I'm not a believer in astrology, but I do love astronomy. So that's what we're going to start talking about. So hopefully you learned something through this lecture about the ancient cultures that actually studied astrology and why they went and did what they did studying astrology. So let's get going. And there's Yoda, just because I love Star Wars. Okay, so definition of astronomy. Astronomy is the study of the universe, which includes planets and their satellites and basically everything in space. So that's what you're studying in astronomy. You're studying even the Earth. The Earth isn't a planet in space. So anytime you're studying objects in space, that's really astronomy. And it's pretty neat to see how far we've come with astronomy. It was actually developed from very simple observations about the movements of the sun, the moon, and planets. And eventually it became what it is today. It didn't happen overnight. It took a very, very long time. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 weeks is this development of astronomy and how it started from astrology and why that was. Okay. You need to know this definition. You got to know it's kind of like archaeology. It's archaeoastronomy. So archaeology, you're studying ancient things like ancient cities, things like that. Archaeoastronomy, you're studying the astronomy of ancient people. So we're going to start by learning about the 4 earliest true civilizations. And who were those 4 civilizations and where did they live? So you're going to have to know those for your test, so make sure you get those down. So here's an example of something that you would study in archaeoastronomy. Hopefully you have an idea of what this is. If you don't, well, it's a multiple choice question. So here you go. Is this a strip mall in Woodstock? Probably not a strip mall in Woodstock. Is it a pretty picture? I think it's a pretty picture, but probably not the best picture. Could probably do better than this. Or is it where they keep Elvis's brain alive in a jar? You'll see sometimes I put silly things like this on tests and stuff. I got to keep myself entertained somehow, guys, so bear with me. Or is it Stonehenge, which is something used to predict the winter and summer solstice? So this is definitely actually going to be Stonehenge. There was actually news just about a week or 2 ago. They actually just found, they believe they've located the place where they actually got the stones to make Stonehenge. It's about 15 miles away from actual Stonehenge. So Stonehenge, if you don't know, it was created around 3000 BC, and it's in England, and it's used. It's kind of like a calendar. It's aligned with the sun, the moon, and the stars. And it's like a big, just astronomical calendar. So we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Here's another example, kind of like the Stonehenge in England, but these are called the Callanish stones in Scotland. They have a very similar purpose. There's 13 stones around in a circle almost, and then there's 1 stone in the center. And that's just Cartman. I used to like South Park a lot. So Callanish stones in Scotland, they're probably used for some type of prehistoric lunar observatory. That's one of the guesses. And this was built about 5,000 years ago. So obviously these ancient people, they try to keep track of the motions of heavenly bodies. And so we're going to learn about why that is in just a few minutes. Why do they care about keeping track of these celestial objects moving in the sky? What do you guys think? Why would someone care about that? Is it just because they want to learn knowledge, or is there other reasons as well? So here's the answer to that question I just gave you. So these cultures, these nomadic cultures, they look to the heavens for guidance and changes in the natural cycles in order to survive year after year. So a long time ago, it was very, very important that you understood what time of year it is. You know, they needed a calendar. They needed a way to keep track of the yearly cycles. And they did that by looking up in the sky. And different cultures would use different objects in the sky. Sometimes they would use positions of the sun. Sometimes they would use positions of the moon. Sometimes they would use positions of stars, just stars in the sky. So that's what we're going to be talking about then. So why did they care about knowing the seasons and the calendar? What's the purpose of that? Well, how did these cultures live? You know, back in the day, you couldn't just go up to McDonald's and get yourself a double quarter pounder with cheese meal for lunch. You had to actually grow your own food. And in order to grow your own food, you had to know when to plant your crops and when to harvest your crops, which means you had to know what season it was. So that's the reason this is so important, knowing what time of year it is. That's the reason that those astrologer priests that we talked about last week were so important to their cultures, because those astrologers were the ones that kept track of the cycles, the yearly cycles of the stars, the planets, and the sun and moon, and they could read the skies, and they knew exactly what time of year it was based upon the positions of those objects. So since they knew what time of year it was, they could tell the people when to plant and when to harvest their crops, which is why they were so important back in the day. So there were 4 true early civilizations. We have to know these 4, and I want you to know where they lived. Hopefully you can think of a couple on your own. These are very famous cultures still around today, most of them. They have a couple of them have changed a little bit. We'll talk about that. So the first one is the Chinese, and you see that they lived along the Huanghe River. That was where they set up their civilization. Okay, in India you had them setting up along the Indus River. You had Babylonia and Sumeria. They were along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this is the area that's called Mesopotamia. I'll show you where that is coming up. And then you also had the Egyptians along the Nile River. So you'll notice that each of these 4 civilizations, they all lived along rivers. Why would they want to live along rivers? Well, if you're planting crops, you need water for those crops. So that's why they lived along rivers. So they had plenty of water for their crops, so they could have plenty of food for their people. So this right here, this is called the Fertile Crescent here. You can see it right here. It looks like a crescent shape. So this is the Tigris, and this is the Euphrates. And the land here is some of the richest land in the world. You'll see Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. So this land here is very, very fertile. You can grow basically anything there. Lots of oil there. There's wars that are constantly fought over this land. And this is where the Babylonians and Sumerians lived, which were called the Mesopotamians. Mesopotamia actually means middle or between. So between 2 rivers here. So between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that's where you had one of the oldest ancient civilizations living, the Mesopotamians. That's that area right there. All right, in this picture, you can see a dragon, some type of bird up here. So hopefully you recognize this dragon. So hopefully you know that this would be the Chinese culture. So next up we got the Chinese, very, very ancient civilization. And the Chinese were very, very good at observing the sky. They were actually one of the first to make a 365.25 day calendar, which was very impressive for the time. The Egyptians and Chinese, there's debates about who made the calendar first, but they were definitely able to make a accurate calendar using the objects in the sky, stars and the moon, and their movements across the sky. So pretty impressive, but a couple other things about the Chinese, they were actually able to predict eclipses as well. And that was very, very, very important at the time. So a minute ago I asked you, why did these ancient cultures actually study astronomy? Why did they care about the cycles that are in the sky? And we said the purpose of that is because they want to live. They have to be able to harvest their crops and grow crops, which means they need to know what season it is. And so all of these ancient cultures, their gods, their deities, they thought of the sun and the moon and the stars as these celestial objects as gods. And so since the sun, bringer of life, was responsible for bringing life to their crops, that was the highest god, the god that they cherished the most, the one that they worshiped the most. And so whenever eclipses would occur, it actually scared them a lot, because during an eclipse, especially a solar eclipse, they actually thought that there was a dragon coming to actually eat the sun. There was a big fight between the sun and a monster, a dragon. And so it was nice that they could actually predict eclipses, because whenever they knew an eclipse was going to come, they would ring their warning bell, and you were supposed to go home, lock yourself in your homes, and then just start praying to the god of the sun that he can defeat the evil monster, the evil dragon trying to come and eat him. So very, very important to these ancient cultures that they knew when eclipses were going to occur because of that, because they all worship the sun. So we'll talk more about that on the next slide. So they were able to actually predict when eclipses would occur. Very impressive feat. So in all these ancient cultures, I already showed you the calendar stones and Stonehenge, but here's another one. So this is actually called the Temple of Heaven. This is actually in Beijing, China. A very, very old temple. And the purpose of it, you can see like there's a needle up top. So that actually points towards the rising midwinter sun. And think about it, midwinter. So what comes after winter? So after winter, you have spring. So when that needle up top is pointing to the sun, they know they have to start getting their seeds ready so that they can plant their crops. If you've ever been to Epcot at Walt Disney World, in the China Pavilion, they actually have a replica of the Temple of Heaven here. So Temple of Heaven, Pyramid of the Sun. Sorry, not Pyramid of the Sun, my bad. It's Temple of Heaven, which is pointing towards the sun. So there's actually an ancient legend, it's kind of entertaining, that about two Chinese astronomers called Hai and Ho. And I just mentioned this, but since the Chinese feared eclipses, the astronomers were supposed to ring a bell whenever an eclipse was going to happen. And these two astronomers at the time, Hai and Ho, they did not ring the bell. They were not able to predict an eclipse happening, a solar eclipse. So everyone went about their daily business, and then all of a sudden an eclipse started, and the sun started disappearing because people thought that a dragon was actually eating it. And it just created mass chaos in the streets, and people were trampled on, and people got killed from everyone running to get home to try to pray to save the sun god. And because of that mass hysteria caused by those two astronomers not being able to predict an eclipse, Hai and Ho were actually beheaded. So very important, if you were an astrologer priest or someone that was studying the stars, you had to know these signs, you had to be able to read them. And if you were successful, they gave you a lot of power, you were a very important person. If you were not successful, they would kill you. So that's the legend of Hai and Ho. And this is the Temple of Heaven. So the Great Temple at Beijing, it's oriented to point towards the rising midwinter sun because spring comes next. So how to know the seasons. And you'll see there's buildings like this all over the world that are devoted to pointing towards the sun on certain times of the year, just so they could keep track and have a calendar system. So next up, the Babylonians and Assyrians. They used the sun and other celestial bodies to tell them when to plant and harvest their crops. So in their system of their calendar system, they always used the 4th month of the calendar for sowing, which means for planting, and then the 11th month of their calendar system was named for reaping or harvesting. So 4th month they planted, the 11th month they always harvested. And they used the moon for their calendar system. So they used the moon. The cycle of the moon goes through phases every 29.5 days. So moon going through phases every 29.5 days. If they have 12 months in their year, if you do the math there, 29.5 times 12, well, that actually does not add up to 365 days. That actually only adds up to 354 days. So their calendar was actually off, which is not good. So what they did, so in order to get a full year, they used 12 months alternating between 29 and 30 days. That way it gave them an average of 29.5 days per year. But what happened though is since they were 11 days off every year, every few years they would have to add another month to the year. And so that would make their calendar system have 13 months instead of the normal 12. And so when they did that, when they had to add a 13th month, it affected their harvest for that year because instead of using 12 months, they had to use 13. So it made their times off, their dates off for harvesting, which means they didn't get as much food, which means if they didn't have enough food, people would starve and they would die. So it became a very unlucky number, 13, because they had to add that 13th month. That's where the unlucky number 13 comes from. So kind of interesting story there. That's why a lot of other cultures, they didn't use the moon. They use, positions of the stars with the moon as well. Example would be the Egyptians. We'll talk about them in just a few minutes. So if you look at this picture here, you'll see that there's this guy and notice his really, really long beard. This is one of those astrologer priests that I keep mentioning. So these are the guys that were really important to the civilization because they kept track of the positions of the planets and constellations and stars and the sun and moon. So this would be an astrologer priest. And these are the guys that studied the cycles of and came up with the idea of the zodiac constellations, the zodiac signs. So this is just a plate. I just thought it looked cool. But if you look around the edge of the plate, you'll see all of these zodiac signs. So we can count here. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are 12 zodiac constellations here. There are currently 12 zodiac constellations. So a zodiac constellation is just a constellation that falls behind the sun. So the sun takes a certain path across the sky, and if the sun crosses that constellation, it is known as a zodiac constellation. That's how those astrologer priests kept track of the yearly cycle, by looking at where the sun was and where those zodiac constellations were. So the path the sun takes across the sky, this is another definition you're going to have to know. It's called the ecliptic. Ecliptic. Path the sun takes across the sky is called the ecliptic. And so these 12 zodiac constellations are constellations that fall on the ecliptic. We'll talk more about that when we talk about constellations. Okay, next up, the Egyptians. So the Egyptians, very, very famous culture. You probably, I'm going to tell you that there's a famous structure out there that's used for, it's aligned with the cardinal directions, actually. And you probably know what that is already. It's called the Pyramids of Giza. And so they built all these pyramids, and a lot of them had very, very high astronomical significance. So the Egyptians, they actually used a star in the sky. It's called the dog star, Sirius. So Sirius, whenever I think of Sirius, a lot of students actually hear the word Sirius, they think of Harry Potter. If you've seen those movies or read the books, you know who Sirius is. Well, Sirius, he can actually turn into an animal, and he turns into a dog. Or maybe you have Sirius satellite radio. Sirius satellite radio, their mascot is actually a dog. And so there's a reason for that. The star Sirius is called the dog star because it's part of the dog constellation called Canis Major. There's actually two dogs in the sky. You have Canis Major and you have Canis Minor. So Sirius is basically, it's the eye of the dog. And so whenever the Egyptians saw the star Sirius, they knew that the Nile would flood, and that told them when to plant their crops. So the Egyptians, they worshipped their main deity. Their main god was called the sun god. His name is Ra, and this is pretty wild stuff that they came up with. But they believed that when you're looking at the sun, so the sun is actually being carried across the sky by the sun god Ra, and the sky itself is actually Ra's daughter called Nut. This kind of sounds like night, Nut. It's very similar. So there's the sun god Ra. You can see the sun on his head. And then here is Newt right here. So this would be Earth, Mother Earth. This would be the underworld, and this is Newt. So what the sun god would do, sometimes he's in a chariot carrying it across the sky, or sometimes he's walking. But he would actually walk across his daughter's back, going around the Earth, and then he would go inside the Earth and go back to the other side through the underworld. So that's Newt. This is Mother Earth, and this is the underworld. So pretty, I don't think I could come up with that if I lived back then. That's pretty interesting, pretty clever thoughts there. So there's famous structures all over the world like that, and they were all used for some type of calendar system. We're going to talk about a few more. So Stonehenge, I mentioned this already, but a group of massive stones that aligned with the sun and the moon, and I'll show you that again coming up. Okay, so we said this is Stonehenge. We said Stonehenge is in England. It's from 3000 BC is when it was made, we think. And we said it's used to predict the winter and summer solstice, because what happens is the sun will shine through some of these columns on that day. So the winter solstice and summer solstice, those words mean something. You need to know that. So the summer solstice is the longest day of the year, and then the winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. So you got 4 days that we need to know. We'll learn more about these in our next unit on constellations. But you have the equinoxes. You have the vernal and autumnal equinox, and then you have the summer solstice and the winter solstice. So we'll talk more about those later on sometime. Okay. Next place I want you to know, maybe you've seen this before, but this is St. Peter's Cathedral. This is actually in Rome, Italy. This is where the Pope lives, over this way. You got the Sistine Chapel over there. And when this was built, it was actually built in alignment with the sun on the equinox. So equinox means you have day hours and night hours that are equal. So the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox. That means you have 12 hours of day, 12 hours of night. And there's this window there. It's called the window of the Holy Ghost. And on the equinox, light will shine through, the sunlight will shine perfectly through that window, and it makes all these God rays shine down all over the basilica. So if you ever get a chance, you should go to Rome and see the Vatican. It's pretty neat. Very beautiful. You can see the Sistine Chapel. You get to see St. Peter's Cathedral. And then you get to see the Swiss Guard. They're always fun looking. There's a Swiss Guard right there. I love their outfits with their little hats. And then that's the window of the Holy Ghost there. So pretty neat. If you ever get a chance, make sure you go see that. Okay. Next up, we got the Egyptians. So the Egyptians, they have these pyramids. They're called the Pyramids of Giza. And I've always thought when I was a kid I wanted to go to these pyramids and see them just because they look so neat in their pictures. But when you actually go, you realize that it's really a dirty place, and it's kind of sad because the city is just right next to these pyramids. I always thought that when I was a kid, the pyramids were, just out on their own in the middle of like a desert, but that's not the case. The city is literally just 100 feet away from these pyramids. So there's 3 pyramids. These were built about 2,500 BC was around the time when these pyramids were built. And these pyramids are amazing for several reasons, but one of the main ones is these pyramids are actually almost perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. So you can see how there's one line coming this way, one line down there, one line there, and another one on the other side. These lines here are aligned, they're no more than 1/12 of a degree off a perfect due north, south, east, and west. At most, 1/12 of a degree off. That is it. That is pretty incredible when you think about it, with the size of these pyramids. I mean, I think the biggest pyramid here it's 400 something feet tall. These things are huge. These are massive, and they were able to build these to within that kind of accuracy. That is impressive. We can't do that today. And since there's 3 as well, 3 pyramids, their alignment actually kind of goes along with, in Greek mythology, there's a hunter known as Orion, Orion's belt. It's a very famous constellation. And the pyramids are aligned with that belt, except in Egyptian mythology, it's not Orion, it's actually the god Osiris. So Osiris, he's the god of rebirth and the afterlife. And coming from Osiris, you have the Nile River, which is actually the Milky Way galaxy in the sky. And along Osiris, behind Osiris, you've got the dog star Sirius. So all this stuff was very, very important to the Egyptians because they knew the Nile would flood based upon seeing the star Sirius. So they built these pyramids with this knowledge in mind to honor the gods. So kind of neat, though. Make sure you know that almost perfectly aligned with north, south, east, west. The pyramids of Giza are all three of them are almost perfect. That is crazy. There they are. There's the three pyramids right there. You can see they're kind of aligned, just like the three stars on Orion's belt are. And then there's the city actually right there. So you can see how close the city is. It's kind of a shame. This is from a KFC, which is right next door to the pyramids. You can see those pyramids right there. Now this one here, this is at Teotihuacan, Mexico. I've actually gotten to go to this one. There are three pyramids here as well. The largest one is called the Pyramid of the Sun, and then you also have the Pyramid of the Moon, and then you have Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. And these three pyramids are also aligned with the three stars of Orion's belt. And you can kind of see up here, this is a pretty tall pyramid as well. It's 270 feet or so, something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but you can see that there's some people up here standing. This pyramid, you're actually still allowed to walk up to the very top. So the Pyramid of the Sun was built about 200 AD, and it's actually, I think it's 213 feet tall. That's how tall it is. So this is Pyramid of the Sun, Teotihuacan, Mexico. And there's always a big party during the summer solstice at this pyramid. It's a very popular place to go because it is aligned with the summer solstice. So the rising and setting sun on the summer solstice is perfectly aligned with this temple. So you can see like the shadow following these stairs going across on that date. So summer solstice, we said, is the longest day of the year. So they use this pyramid as a way of keeping track of time. It was their calendar. So pretty neat, I think, at least. And so we said, yeah, just like in Egypt, there are three pyramids here, and they are aligned with the three stars in Orion's belt. Okay, we got to get through one more culture. This last culture we're going to talk about, it was a little later. It wasn't one of the earliest ones. This next culture came from actually the Mesopotamians. Eventually they spread and became this culture. So we're talking about the Greek culture. So Greeks with astronomy, Greeks are very, very popular civilization to talk about because they did so much for astronomy. So here's a picture of what the early Greeks thought about the sky and what they wrote down about what they believed the earth was and the sky and the heavens. We're going to be talking about this model here coming up later on this week. We're going to start talking about some of the famous original philosophers and astronomers that studied this stuff. But here is just an idea of what the Greeks did. So the Greeks, starting around 600 BC, the Greeks actually started to try to describe the cosmos, and they actually wrote down their findings and just tried to actually learn and discover what the heck was going on with the sky. So they didn't just notice the cycles. They actually tried to explain what was happening. So you can see anytime you're trying to explain something, you're actually starting to do some science here. So we're going to see how astrology and astronomy are going to start branching off here with the Greeks. Around 600 BC, this is starting to happen. So their concepts at first were based on religion or philosophy and not science at first. But eventually we're going to see them start branching off and actually trying to explain with actual science what was going on. But at first it was just religion and philosophy. So we're going to talk some about the great philosophers of the time. You got Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and a couple more that you haven't heard of, Thales, Anaximander. So we're going to talk about these guys, what their beliefs were, and why did they believe what they did. So in this picture here, they actually thought that the Earth was a flat disk or cylinder floating in water, air, or space. So here you can see there's disc or cylinder right here. This is more of a cylinder shape, but it's flat, and there's nothing under it. It could be air, space, or water. Depending on who the philosopher was, they thought it was different substance. And then you can see the sun, the moon, and then you don't see stars here. You see a region of fire. So we're going to talk about what exactly that was. Where are all the stars? Why is it called the region of fire? That's things we're going to talk about when we start talking about Thales and Anaximander and a couple other of these. I like to call them famous old dudes because that's what they are. So these guys that got to study this stuff, they were pretty important people. They actually had money. They didn't have to go and have a real job. They actually had money. They were very powerful, influential people. And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, where do these guys, why did they do this? Why did they just sit around and think about stuff? And the reason is because they could. This was entertainment to them. They didn't have TV. They didn't have Nintendos. They didn't have PlayStations. This is what people did for fun back in the day. They actually liked to go out and learn if they could. So at this point in time, the only people that could go out and do these things were rich people. So if they had money, they didn't have to work. They didn't have to go work the fields and do manual labor. They could actually sit around with their friends and just think about things, and that's what they did. And so if you think about it, where do you do your best thinking at? Where do you guys do your best thinking at? So I keep that in mind coming up on these next few slides here. So this is a picture I took when I was in an ancient town of Greece. It's actually called the city of Ephesus. And this is not actually in Greece. This is actually in Turkey, but it is a Greek town in Turkey. And so what does it look like we're seeing here? Any ideas what we're looking at here? So this is actually the bathroom, the bathhouse in Ephesus. So Ephesus is an ancient town, Greek town in Turkey, and most of these ancient towns, wherever you go around the world, you'll see ruins of ancient towns, and a lot of times those ancient towns, they're square, and they have a wall around the outside to protect them. And then there's two main roads. There's one road that runs north to south, and there's another road that runs east to west. And in the middle, where those two roads cross, that's called the town square. And you always find two buildings in the town square. It doesn't matter what ancient town you go to, they're usually all about the same. And there's always two buildings you always find. Can you think of what those two buildings are in the middle, in the town square? Those two buildings you'll always find, you'll find the library and you'll find the bathhouse. So the library and the bathhouse, those are the two buildings that you'll always find in the middle during the town squares. And so the reason I put this in here is because I always like to picture, you have these philosophers, these Greek philosophers that had a lot of money, didn't have to do much work. And I just see them, going to these bathhouses and sitting down and just, sitting on, these are actually toilets here, just sitting there and just thinking about stuff, with their friends, talking about, what shape is the earth? Where is the earth in the universe? Are we in the middle? Or is the sun the middle? Is the sun the center? Is the earth the center? What are we floating in something? Those are all questions that these guys were trying to figure out, just think about and try to come up with answers. And it's pretty neat, this place. I'm not kidding when I say these things. This is actually where these guys did their best thinking. In the center here, when you go here, there's actually a big pond, a pond with lily pads on the pond. And I always like to ask my class, well, what do you think? Why did they have a pond in the very center of this bathroom with lily pads? And people are always like, oh, they use the lily pads to wipe themselves. And I was like, no, that's not actually what they use them for. Who usually lives on lily pads? You think about it. And the answer is frogs. They actually had frogs in the center in these ponds in the middle of the bathrooms. And the reason for that, those frogs would actually make noise while you were sitting there on the toilet, doing your business. So they would make noise to cover up all the sounds you're making when you're trying to, do your business. And so I always just thought that was neat because that's actually true. That's actually what happens in these towns. So you always find two buildings, the bathhouse and then the library. And this is another place that's very famous. This is the library of Ephesus. These are the ruins of it. But you always have those two buildings, library and bathhouse. So you do your best thinking in the library. And then as you're thinking about something, you're like, I wonder why this is. You can go over to the library and then look in the journals and the scripts and scribes, and see if you can come up with an answer. So this is just a brief overview of the ancient civilizations. Why did they learn this stuff? Why did they study this stuff? And the reason is because they wanted to survive. They wanted to live. They needed to know when to plant and harvest their crops. And so the next section of notes, we're actually going to start talking about individual astronomers and philosophers and what they studied and what they believed about where the Earth is and the sun is and the moon and the stars and what they believe the Earth's moon and stars are actually made of and sun. So that's what we're going to talk about next is the actual individual astronomers and philosophers. But that's going to be it for today's notes. Tomorrow, I think I'm going to have a video that I want you to watch. It's going to be a YouTube video. And then there's going to be questions that you're going to have to answer that go along with the video. Thanks, guys.